Bob Dylan turned 85 on May 24, 2026, and this video is about the admission he kept circling back to across decades of rare interviews, the one that had nothing to do with a song and everything to do with a person he let down in front of the whole world. Most people who love Bob Dylan's music never actually met the man behind the mythology. What they met was a projection, a shape the culture had already decided on before he had any say in the matter. That gap between the legend the world demanded and the private person living underneath it drove nearly every decision Dylan made for the rest of his life, including the ones that still haven't been fully forgiven. By 1963, the folk scene in Greenwich Village had already made up its mind about Bob Dylan. He was 22 years old, writing songs that carried an unusual weight for someone that young, and when Blowin' in the Wind arrived that year, followed closely by The Times They Are a-Changin', a generation that was frightened and searching for language, decided he would carry their words for them. Nobody asked, nobody checked, the label arrived fully formed, voice of a generation, and Dylan spent the next 6 decades trying to outrun it. His 2004 memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, described that pressure with unmistakable frustration. He wrote that he never wanted the role of Pied Piper, that the expectations people had pressed onto him felt less like an honor and more like a structure built entirely out of other people's need. What he wanted was to follow his own artistic questions. What the movement wanted was a symbol. Those two things were never going to live inside the same person, and the collision between them explains almost every controversy that followed. Newport, Rhode Island, July 25, 1965. Dylan walked onto the Newport Folk Festival stage with an electric Fender Stratocaster and a full band, played 3 songs into a crowd of folk purists, and the response ranged from confusion to open fury. Pete Seeger, who had given his life to American folk music and to the idea that songs could carry social justice across generations, was reportedly so disturbed by the electric sound that he wanted to physically cut the power cables. Dylan returned for an acoustic encore, but the rupture between him and the folk community had already opened. What makes Dylan's later reflections on Newport worth paying attention to is the absence of armor in them. In Martin Scorsese's 2005 documentary, No Direction Home, Dylan looked back at that period without the sarcasm he had used in younger years to deflect criticism. A man came through who understood what the rupture had cost, even while maintaining that the artistic choice itself was not a mistake. Going electric wasn't the regret. The damage it left behind was, and some of the people paying that price hadn't done anything to deserve it. The clearest example of that was Joan Baez. She had been a celebrated folk singer before Dylan was known outside of Greenwich Village, and she was the one who brought him on stage at her own concerts in the early 1960s, introducing him to audiences who might never have found him otherwise. Their relationship was both professional and deeply personal. When Dylan's 1965 British tour arrived, the one filmmaker D.A. Pennebaker documented in Don't Look Back. Baez traveled with the tour fully expecting to share the stage as she had before. Dylan never once invited her up, not on any night of that entire tour. She waited in the wings, watched him perform, and eventually went home. Baez spoke about that experience with striking candor for the rest of her career, describing the humiliation of it, the feeling of having helped build a person into a legend only to be treated as invisible once the legend no longer needed building. For a long time, Dylan said almost nothing. The silence held for years, and then slowly, it didn't. Through interviews Dylan gave in the 1980s and beyond, he acknowledged, without always naming her directly, that his behavior toward people during that era had left damage he hadn't registered at the time. Our speed was part of it, the pace at which he was moving artistically, the sense that stopping wasn't possible. A Rolling Stone interview from those later years carried what amounted to a reckoning, not the formal public apology people expect from celebrities, but an honest statement that the people around him during those years hadn't always received the care they deserved. The folk community knew exactly what he meant. Joan Baez knew. And after decades of silence, that was something real. October 2016 brought news that surprised almost everyone. The Swedish Academy awarded Bob Dylan the Nobel Prize in Literature, the first time a songwriter had ever received it, and the literary world immediately divided into 2 camps. One side treated it as long overdue recognition that lyrics set to music can carry the same weight as any novel. The other considered it an insult to the tradition of Faulkner, Camus, and Toni Morrison. Dylan's response to the announcement was, in retrospect, entirely consistent with who he is. He went silent. The Academy tried reaching him for weeks and couldn't get through. When December arrived and the Stockholm ceremony came, Dylan cited prior commitments and stayed home, which meant Patti Smith stood at that podium instead, performing A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall before the assembled Nobel audience. By most accounts, the performance became one of the most genuinely moving moments the ceremony had ever produced. Dylan's Nobel lecture, submitted as an audio recording in June 2017, is where he actually showed his hand. His first instinct upon receiving the news, he admitted directly, was to question whether his songs qualified as literature at all. He sat with that question honestly rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. The lecture traveled back to his musical roots, to Buddy Holly and Lead Belly, and the American tradition that shaped him, before turning toward Homer's Odyssey and arguing that, like the songs of ancient Greece, his own work was built to live in the air between a performer and a listener, not flat on a page. That wasn't false modesty. Dylan was making a serious intellectual case for why the prize both fit his work and didn't fit the existing category, and he made it with the precision of someone who had genuinely wrestled with the question across 50 years. When Dylan published The Philosophy of Modern Song in 2022, he was 81 years old, and the interviews he gave around that book carried a different weight than anything from his earlier decades. The performance had thinned out. The evasion was largely gone. A man came through who had outlived most of his world and was willing to say so plainly. Mortality had become daily company rather than something to push away, and a 2022 Wall Street Journal interview confirmed as much. Losing Johnny Cash had done something to him that never fully healed. Cash had written Dylan a fan letter in the early 1960s, when Dylan was barely known, and Cash was one of the most famous voices in American country music. Cash had also defended him publicly during years when plenty of established artists were dismissive. That kind of loyalty, freely given before Dylan had done anything to earn it from Cash's perspective, was not something Dylan ever forgot. Cash's death in 2003 left a particular kind of quiet, and Dylan never entirely came back from it. The most difficult thing Dylan ever said publicly about his own work came earlier, in a 60 Minutes interview with Ed Bradley in 2004. Dylan talked about those early compositions, Blowin' in the Wind, and A Hard Rain's a Gonna Fall, and the whole run of songs that made his name, and he said he no longer understood how he had written them. Some source he couldn't name precisely had been available to him back then, and that source wasn't available anymore. He could still perform those songs every night, and he still does, but the place they came from had closed. He described it as a wellspring that existed once and couldn't be returned to. And he wasn't performing humility when he said it. He was reporting a fact as clearly and simply as he knew how. None of that stopped him. The never-ending tour, which has carried him across the world for nearly 4 decades, keeps moving because the impulse driving it was never nostalgia. Forward motion itself was always the point. The folk community never entirely forgave him for Newport. Joan Baez built an extraordinary career that needed nothing from him. The protest movement found other voices, other anthems, and kept going. And Dylan kept going too, through a period of Christian gospel music, through country recordings, through a run of late-career albums that critics spent years arguing about. At 85, what his story leaves behind is something more complicated than a catalog of great songs, though the songs genuinely are great. A portrait remains of an artist who received a gift he couldn't fully explain and couldn't fully control, who hurt people in his path because the speed of his own movement left no room to stop, who resented being turned into a symbol, and yet spent his entire life unable to escape the fact that he was one. Somewhere in his 80s he sat down to write a book about other people's songs rather than his own, and that was probably the most honest thing he could have done. The regret in Dylan's story was never about the music, the regret was about the people. And the fact that he eventually said so, however slowly, however imperfectly, is the part of his biography that feels most human and most worth carrying forward. Happy birthday, Bob. Leave a comment below with the first Bob Dylan song that ever stopped you in your tracks, the first time that voice came out of a speaker and made you set down whatever you were doing, your first lyric, your first album, the first time it hit you. We read every one.